My name is Kate, and I'm the academic convener for the Affordable Housing Hallmark and a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Melbourne. So before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, which for me is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but of course maybe many different lands depending on where you're joining us from. I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the particular relevance of today's topic for First Nations people who are disproportionately suffering violence and disproportionately suffer from intergenerational trauma as well, and who are important actors driving solutions and change in this area. So my role today is to say as little as possible and to make space for our panel of experts and the discussion that they will no doubt provoke. But let me first introduce the Hallmark and the seminar series before we get into the major details for today. So the Affordable Housing Hallmark is a 3-year research initiative designed to bring together researchers from across the university and partners from across sectors to advance research and action that supports affordable housing outcomes. We are led by Professor Alan Pert and are privileged to have an advisory committee with people from academia, industry, government, and not-for-profit. And that advisory panel is led by Professor Ros Hansen. In 2019, we launched a seed funding round with the goal of stimulating interdisciplinary housing research and supporting early career researchers. We funded 5 projects across a range of topics, and these projects will be forming the basis of each of the seminars that we have coming up over the next few months. We'll be hosting one per fortnight, same time, same place, always on a Tuesday afternoon, always coming at you via Zoom. And that's something that we really are excited to be able to share with people. And today is, of course, the first of that series, celebrating the first of those seed-funded projects. So I'm really pleased to be highlighting the work of Erica Martino and her team today, who we funded to investigate opportunities for crisis accommodation for survivors of family violence. Given the intense pressure that COVID-19 has placed on households and the spike in family violence we have seen recently, I think that topic was incredibly relevant at the time that we funded it, and it is even more so now. So we are joined by a panel of experts who will share their insights into, amongst other things, the facilitators and barriers to generating additional crisis housing, how this might support trauma-informed care, and the required mechanisms and governance processes that might support housing and service models for this group. We have given each speaker 7 minutes to present, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. And we're going to hold a question round at the end, so make sure that you're holding on to the things that you want to say or the questions you want to ask, and we'll do that at the end of this event. Professor Carolyn Weitzman is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne, and an international housing and social policy consultant. And many of you will know her as the head of Transforming Housing, which is a research project that led to the Hallmark Research Initiative. She coordinated the Toronto Safe City Committee from '89 to '99 and was a professor of urban planning at UniMelb from 2003 to 2019. She's a member of the Planning Institute of Australia and the co-author of lead editor of 6 books, 12 book chapters, 41 peer-reviewed articles, 15 major reports, and 23 peer-reviewed conference papers. So she is eminently qualified to talk on this topic.
Hi there, everyone. I wish I could be here in person, but you have my disembodied head. This is Carolyn Weitzman, now at the University of Ottawa, and I'm here to provide a Canadian perspective. Now just let me upload my slides. Whoops. Okay. So Canada and Australia are very similar countries. Canada has 50% more people, but the exact same proportion, approximately 1/3 of households rent, and we have the exact same extremely low proportion of social housing. In Canada, there's been a big effort to get more gender disaggregated data. So we can say that 40% of households are women-led, and that women-led households are far more likely to be in housing stress, by which we mean paying more than 30% of their income in rent. We don't have or I wasn't able to find the exact same statistics for Australia, but it does seem like a similar proportion of households, perhaps more in Australia, are in housing stress. One big difference between Canada and Australia is that there was a shift of government in 2015, and in 2017, a national housing strategy, the first in over 30 years, was launched. And perhaps more significantly, in 2019, the national housing strategy enshrined in law the right to adequate housing, which is based on UN definitions of adequate housing and is the outcome of advocacy over 4 decades. The National Housing Strategy is a 10-year, $55 billion plan to create 100,000 new social and affordable units and to lift 500,000 households out of housing stress, mostly using rental subsidies. There is a gender and intersectional analysis and a target of 25% of all funding for women-led households. This has led to women's housing providers thinking about scaling up very small organizations, and there is the risk of losing the individualized caring approach. So in late 2019, a colleague, Marie Desroches, and I focused on 3 cities, Montreal and the twin cities of Ottawa-Gatineau, Montreal being the 2nd largest city in Canada, Ottawa-Gatineau combined being the 4th largest city in Canada. And we spoke to women's housing providers and housing policy officers and advocacies about how to balance scaling up and caring. When we talk about an intersectional approach in Canada, as in Australia, 90% of Indigenous women have low incomes and 90% of homeless women are Indigenous, much higher proportion than the population, which is about 5% in Canada. Older women are more likely to have low incomes, and as we've seen under COVID, the condition in long-term care, nursing homes as they're known in Australia, has been extremely substandard. With the lack of appropriate and affordable housing, women who are being released from institutions, and under COVID, women have been released from jail, are finding it hard to find shelter and are swelling the ranks of homeless shelters. LGBTQ folks are much more likely to be homeless, particularly amongst youth, and sometimes face harassment in the shelter system. Immigrant and racialized women earn less, and one of the big campaigns in Canada is to get better race-based data, because clearly COVID has been hitting racialized and immigrant populations much harder. And of course, violence against women with disabilities is higher, and it's harder to flee violent relationships because of discrimination and lack of adequate, accessible housing. One of the big things that we heard from women's housing providers is discomfort, contempt for the notion of a directional housing ladder. Most people do not simply move in one direction from being homeless into emergency shelters, into transitional housing, into social housing. Furthermore, there are bottlenecks at emergency shelters, not enough. There are bottlenecks at transitional housing, not enough. And there are bottlenecks at social housing, really not enough. As women age, their needs may change. So we prefer the City of Kelowna's approach, which is looking at immediate safety net shelter, looking at long-term supportive housing, and vastly increasing the proportion of those, and perhaps decreasing the proportion of new speculative housing. Our recommendations were to invest in capacity building for women's housing providers, 10-year plans, for instance, to provide better gender disaggregated data at all levels of government, to collect consistent data, to listen to the experts of experience, who are women who've experienced homelessness and housing precarity, and to promote the integration of housing and services, because sometimes the barrier is providing adequate service funding in support of housing. There has been a big movement to redefine homelessness, to incorporate aspects of women's homelessness. We know that hidden homelessness includes survival sex, couch surfing, and staying in violent relationships. And those situations are not included in homeless counts, but that may be changing due to recent advocacy. There was a national housing advocate and a national housing council promised in the National Housing Strategy Act. They will be located in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which will allow independent monitoring of government policies and targets at all levels of government. And the National Housing Council will include women with lived experience of homelessness. There's funding for a new national women's housing and homelessness network. And the Canadian Urban Institute recently held a Right to Home Week and are hosting The Shift, which is an international organization that is working with governments on institutionalizing the right to housing. And there are a number of cities in Canada that are all working on rights-based local policies. The province of British Columbia, which has been the most progressive province in Canada in terms of housing, have already purchased 3 hotels, one of them women only, plus over a dozen single-room occupancy hotel units that were purchased before COVID for permanent housing, plus have additional emergency rent assistance to the federal program. The federal program, which is called the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, is $2,000, no questions asked, apply online, and the rapid take-up and difference it's made is assisting efforts to get a universal basic income in Canada post-COVID. In Yellowknife, which is a remote community in the north of Canada, think Northern Territory, the federal, territory, and local government collaborated to buy up a 42-unit hotel for emergency women's accommodation. And that is the first federal acquisition strategy since COVID, and hopefully will lead to more. The COVID economic depression, of course, is increasing the risk of homelessness, and we're only now beginning to recognize that 15 units of existing affordable housing were lost for every 1 social unit constructed in Canada between 2011 and 2016 before the strategy. So we have to arrest that hemorrhage. Recovery for All is a national campaign with hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals frantically writing letters to MPs with a costed out plan to end homelessness by 2030. This would involve converting COVID-19 emergency funding to acquire property, and also to incorporate that inclusive definition of homelessness that will up numbers, but also cover a lot of women who are without secure housing. There's strong advocacy for a guaranteed basic income that would include housing costs. There is advocacy to expand the housing strategy to provide 300,000 new, not 100,000, new social and not affordable homes. In other words, scaling up social housing explicitly with very low income households as a priority. There's a need for clear targets at all levels of government with gender and intersectional sub-targets. There's growing concern about financialization, which really increased in Canada after the global financial crisis, and the call for a national housing acquisition fund and for municipalities to have the right of first refusal for any sales of apartment buildings, for instance. And there are continuing calls for a separate, adequately resourced urban and rural Indigenous housing and homelessness strategy. That's more information. I think I've used up my 7 minutes. I look forward to seeing the recording of the other speakers. Bye-bye.
And Dr. Kathleen Flanagan is a DECRA Research Fellow in the University of Tasmania's School of Social Sciences, as well as the Deputy Director of UTAS's Housing and Community Research Unit. Her DECRA Fellowship examines policy constructions of the problem family in Australia. She has contributed extensively to policy-relevant academic housing research in Australia, including research examining housing outcomes for women leaving family violence. Between 2006 and 2011, she worked at Anglicare Tasmania's Social Action and Research Centre, publishing highly regarded reports on housing and related policy areas, and participating in policy advocacy and the development. So we're really lucky to have her here today. And take it away, Kathleen. Love to hear what you have to say.
All right. I'm going to come at today's theme from a slightly different angle, as you will see. And in a way, I'm sorry that Erica ran into technical problems, because I think my presentation would probably have followed on from hers, but we'll just cope with that and move on. Policy and commentary often assumes that leaving a violent relationship is the hard part, and that once the decision is made, the pathway is clear. That's a pathway out of violence and into a better future via a short but supportive stay in crisis accommodation. It may not be an easy pathway, but it is a pathway. This is the assumption. The research I'm describing today tests that assumption. It took place in New South Wales and Tasmania. We spoke to 28 service users and 80 service providers and other stakeholders. Importantly, we were looking at mainstream services. The situation for Indigenous survivors of family violence is very different. We found that for clients of mainstream services, the crisis response to family violence is working relatively well. Most women who had to leave their homes were able to be accommodated in the short term in some kind of crisis housing. Now, that's not to suggest that the system is perfect or to claim that every woman who needs help gets the assistance that she requires. But services are doing a reasonable job under the circumstances. The issue is what happens next. Crisis services play a critical role in providing assistance, including access to shelter. But the system is under considerable pressure, and much of this derives from the lack of realistic and appropriate exit points from crisis assistance into stable long-term housing. Provision of these exit points is beyond the capacity of services and largely beyond their control. All they can do is their best to help their clients access the minimal options that are available. The pathway looks less like this and more like this. Our analysis of policy frameworks across all states found a distinct preference for directing women leaving violence into the private rental market. Increasingly, policy constructs social housing as something best avoided, for reasons I shall leave open for now, but we might be able to talk about later. Both our fieldwork jurisdictions use private rental subsidies to create additional housing options for women leaving family violence. New South Wales has the Start Safely subsidy and Tasmania has a rapid rehousing program. The problem is that we know the private rental market is highly problematic for people on lower incomes. There is a mismatch between the average price of what's on offer and the average incomes of people reliant on income support, as women leaving violence often are. Much of the available affordable supply is of very poor quality. There are significant issues with security of tenure, and this insecurity means tenants are reluctant to assert their rights, lest it result in the loss of their home. There is little sign that things will be much different in the wake of COVID-19. Our research suggests that private rental subsidies can be valuable in certain markets. There, they can provide a degree of choice and flexibility. But in other markets where rents are high and climbing and where vacancy rates are low, the assistance provided is insufficient. It can't effectively defray the cost of rent or make housing of adequate size and quality available. Even if housing is affordable with the subsidy, once the subsidised period ends, the unsubsidised rent becomes unsustainable. Here, housing market failure interacts with other areas of government policy, particularly those policies which hold that, in order to avoid moral hazard, income support payments must be kept at below poverty line levels. When we celebrate the work of food banks and food redistribution services, we can forget that this is not a socially acceptable means of obtaining food in a wealthy country like Australia. We forget that people who rely on food banks, food parcels and food vouchers to put a meal on the table are food insecure by definition. In addition to the mathematical impossibility, even with subsidies, of matching income to rent and living costs, women faced another challenge. In tight markets, landlords had many alternatives to the unemployed single mum with several kids who had just left a violent relationship. This was compounded if a woman had a poor tenancy record due to the behaviour of their violent ex-partner, or was stigmatised because they were in receipt of a government-funded housing subsidy. The lack of options means women can feel pressured to accept accommodation that is substandard, too far from support networks, or located in neighbourhoods or settings that feel unsafe or are unsafe. Women in these circumstances find themselves facing an implicit assumption that any housing is better than the circumstances they have left, and that therefore they should accept any housing. Much of the response to family violence focuses on situations where violence is physically harmful and the risk of serious injury or death is high and ongoing. These situations undeniably exist, and policy and practice need to ensure these women and children are safe and perpetrators are held accountable. But there are other forms of violence. Women trying to leave a violent relationship exercise agency and make decisions based on their own circumstances and needs. In many cases, these needs are governed by the desire to ensure the best possible outcome for their children. For women who have experienced coercive, controlling relationships, but not physical violence, living in a room in a pub or a caravan park or a substandard private rental property may be considered more harmful, especially for children, than does remaining in or returning to the relationship. In summary, not all violence perpetrated against women is lethal violence. Not all violence is physical violence. All violence harms. Yet there was clear evidence in our research that sometimes women return to violent partners because they cannot find long-term housing. We need crisis accommodation, but crisis accommodation by itself is not enough. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Erica Martinez, who is a research fellow and PhD candidate at the Gender and Women's Health Unit, Centre for Health Equity, the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Erica has over 20 years of professional activity in the built environment sector as a designer, urban planner, and GIS specialist. Erica has developed a research program that advances evaluation frameworks, in turn advocating for increased corporate and state social responsibility in delivering healthy urban and social infrastructure. Erica's current research explores how housing policy programs and hybrid partnerships can promote violence prevention and health for marginalised groups through increased access to safe, affordable and quality housing.
As Kate mentioned, I thought I'd discuss some of my tentative research findings from the Hallmark project, which is essentially a scoping review with a series of interviews with stakeholders, namely crisis accommodation and community housing providers, on how crisis accommodation might be improved or expanded by nesting in existing infrastructure. Some sentiments expressed by a lot of the interviewees about the state of crisis, which is supported by a large body of research, is that there is not enough crisis accommodation, that the current options are appalling, and that there is a lack of exit points into longer term affordable and social housing. What I was also hearing from providers is that aside from a general consensus that governments needed to fund and supply new affordable and social housing stock. Right, so as mentioned earlier, some sentiments expressed by interviewees about the state of crisis and supported by a large body of research is that namely that there's not enough, that the current options are appalling, and that as Kathleen indicated there is a lack of exit points into longer term affordable housing and social housing, and that there's a continued focus on conditionality by government policy, which hinders people moving into more secure tenures. What I was also hearing from providers is that aside from a general consensus that governments need to fund and supply new affordable and social housing stock, and also that core and cluster models, housing first and safe at home measures had their place in addressing crisis accommodation, that there needed to be a shift in conception from this idea of a housing ladder with a focus on tenures to housing life cycle, so meeting people's needs through housing, through a more flexible and fluid approach to housing, and that we needed to look at opportunities to nest in existing infrastructure to do that. So some of these opportunities, these are just a few, I'm sure there's many more. So looking at using vacant land and existing commercial buildings for pop-up shelters, and also looking at private rental and state rental brokerage, which usually involves the head leasing of properties through providers for women. Some of the thinking or looking at these practices or programs, some of the barriers that were brought up by providers, which were mainly around real and perceived risks. So particularly for owners and landowners, engaging in these sorts of practices was definitely around meeting a return on investment that was equal to the market. And as Kathleen also indicated, there was stigma around having family violence survivors as tenants, and also potentially stigma around working with community housing providers. There was a perception that there would be more red tape and that there would be more legislation working with community housing providers. There was also uncertainty over insurance options, particularly with short-term rentals. Some of the other barriers that were, or perceived risks that were brought up were around secure income and insurance, and particularly with some of the property management services, was how you manage the turnover of tenants in short-term rentals. So of note, one of the property management services piloted using a head lease property for crisis accommodation. And while they spoke highly of the pilot, they did express concerns around how to manage transitioning women out of the property because the property was deemed to be too good. So the women didn't want to leave, understandably. Another risk that was brought up from service providers was essentially concerns around women's safety and issues around negligence and liability for them. And particularly drawing on some of the housing stock owned by various government departments, there was uncertainty around working with some of these departments. And on that note, looking at or thinking about or speaking, having spoken to some of the stakeholders in local and state government, they also expressed their own frustrations at, with intra and interagency collaboration in trying to get some of these projects off the ground. In terms of enablers, and this has been touched on by some of the speakers, is that we essentially need a more integrated and agile system and subsidy framework. So in terms of identifying sites and matchmaking, having better systems to support matchmaking of opportunities between, for example, sites or opportunities whereby owners have put in applications for building permits where there might be a 6 month or 1 year lag. Setting up systems where local governments can make some of this information more openly available to community housing providers, so they might start to broker relationships. Another thing that came up was around meaningful data sharing. So some of the providers expressed frustration at the focus on numbers and KPIs, and that there needed to be more of a narrative around outcomes, particularly not only outcomes in terms of the women's pathways into other housing tenures, but also that their own internal data and analysis was valued by government departments. Some of the providers felt that they were doing some really good analysis on social return on investment and didn't feel that their data was being valued. Lastly, one of the key issues that came up was around embedding autonomy through subsidies, so providing secure and flexible funding for community housing providers, and also the private sector to either tap into different resources or different infrastructure, and also to create increased capacity for themselves. In terms of potential outcomes, this speaks to, I guess, more generally about providing secure and affordable and social housing. However, I guess the key thing that came out of the discussions was around providing a quality housing environment to assist with women exiting violent relationships, and that this would, I guess, better support a trauma reform perspective. It would be remiss, I guess, to not talk about COVID-19 in the context of what's happening, and it did come up again and again in my discussions with the stakeholders. And I guess what was interesting is two key points came up during these discussions, one of which is that some more traditional accommodation providers, commercial accommodation providers that is, who normally wouldn't engage with homelessness services, are beginning to accept or be open to having them as clients because they are their main source of income at the moment. And also that some of the providers were being contacted by Airbnb owners who were looking to lease their properties short term. However, there were concerns, or there was apprehension around using these properties because of the moratorium on eviction. So there were difficulties accepting these properties because they would still have to serve a notice to vacate for women, and this might cause or would obviously be problematic. So just to finish up, there are mixed views in this space, clearly, particularly when talking about tapping into the increasing vacancy in short-term rentals, that it would be a complement to the hotel space, but there are also reservations around ensuring that women remain safe at a time when they're at their most vulnerable. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you for tying all of the ideas together. I know I have a million questions and a whole lot of different themes that have come up for me, particularly about the lack of exits out of crisis accommodation, the need for alternative options, the implications of violence outcomes, short-term versus long-term housing outcomes, all sorts of things like that. But I would like to give the first right of reply to Jeanette Large, who is the CEO of Women's Property Initiatives, to perhaps give some reflections on what she's heard today and anything she'd like to add.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks to Erica, Carolyn and Kathleen for your presentations. They're all very good, which was not unexpected. So look, being the CEO of Women's Property Initiatives, we focus on long-term housing, long-term housing for women-headed households with or without children. I'm currently a member of a Victorian Women's Housing Alliance, and within that alliance we have representatives from the crisis accommodation to transitional, medium term and then long-term housing. And the main area that we've decided that we'll be working on is to look at the pathway through a woman escaping family violence. And we believe that, I suppose what we believe is that we feel like that we can work quite well together, but to get a much better pathway for the women escaping family violence, but we do need some additional government support to be able to facilitate that in a way that needs to happen. I mean, Kathleen, you highlighted very much what happens, that brick wall that really happens for women. They're in the crisis accommodation, particularly if they don't have the income. Where do they go to next? One of the organisations that is part of the Women's Housing Alliance, and they have the private rental brokerage for the women for 12 months, they've said about 30% of the women after that 12 months may be able to afford to continue that private rental. The rest, it's unaffordable for them, which is something that you've highlighted. That brick wall can come up at different stages. It can come up after the crisis accommodation. It can come up 12 months after the private rental brokerage. It's constant until there is that long-term affordable housing out there. But I suppose the other thing that we're trying to look at within the Women's Housing Alliance too is we believe that there could be additional support offered along the way. So we need the additional accommodation, absolutely. Sometimes the women need the crisis, then they do need maybe a bit more medium term to assist them with the employment, to assist them maybe with some mental health issues or a whole lot of other things. But you know, bottom line is they need that long-term affordable housing at the very end. So I feel, Erica, in your presentation, you talk about how we might be able to look at some different pop-ups or different short-term. Absolutely, maybe we should be looking at some of those as options, but it still doesn't take away what happens after that time. And for me, you know, that's been the passion, I suppose, of the majority of my working life, is that ongoing affordable housing. And I think, you know, maybe I was one of the people that spoke to Erica about feeling that sometimes the social returns on investments that we've had undertaken, and I know other women's housing organisations have had undertaken to show the impact for the women and for their children, the savings for government in whether it be education, whether it be the mental health, the physical health, all of those sorts of things, those outcomes that are so important and contribute to our society in so many ways. So I don't know, maybe it would be good to get some other questions from the audience. I'm pretty biased about what I think needs to be the outcomes. But just to say, look, we're with the Women's Housing Alliance, we're actually putting in a budget bid for 100 women. We're calling it a proposal for housing 100 women from family violence, and being able to try and provide more support, communication, connection, all the way through to then the long-term housing. So we're pretty excited around that. The COVID absolutely has made more of an impact. You know, when you hear the statistics of 200 women a day now, sort of being that police are getting those reports in addition to our family violence, statewide family violence service, it's huge. And I suppose we're waiting for when the short-term accommodation in the hotels and so forth finishes, what the impact of that's going to be. So yes, I don't know if I've got much more to say other than it's such an important issue, and let's try and work together to address it. So thanks, Kate, for the opportunity.
Yeah, and thank you for your response. So we have a bunch of questions. I encourage everyone to continue writing their questions into the box. One we have, if Erica or Kathleen wants to respond, to even Jeanette, if you have the answer, do you have an idea of the degree to which this is a Melbourne or city focused issue versus a regional or rural issue?
Well, we did field work across Tasmania, and parts of Tasmania are very regional and rural, and it was certainly an issue there. And I should say, I mean, you can't get everything into 7 minutes. So I'm not saying that we found that crisis accommodation supply was perfect, because it isn't. It's just that the outstanding issue for us was this: what happens next? And part of the reason why there isn't enough good quality crisis accommodation is because there's no way to move people on from crisis. So people are staying in crisis accommodation for a very long time. But we certainly found, even at the time that we did our field work, Hobart was undergoing a really significant and dramatic change in housing affordability. So our vacancy rate was next to nothing. Our rents went up 40% in a year or something ridiculous. And yet we were still getting similar issues on the Northwest Coast as were being reported in Hobart. So, and part of that's a function of incomes. If people are on New Start allowance, as it was then, it's now job seeker, it doesn't have to be very unaffordable for it to be completely unaffordable for that group of people. And yeah, we also did fieldwork in regional New South Wales and similar issues there. I can't speak for Victoria, obviously, but Erica might be able to.
Did you have a take on that, Erica?
Yeah, just on that. So in terms of the regional and rural, and again, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but there are issues with affordable housing in regional areas, and I think there's a misconception in Victoria that regional areas, because there is cheaper housing available, that therefore it follows that women are able to find housing. But I don't think that's, from what I've been reading and from what I've heard from providers, is that's not necessarily the case, particularly with refuges and more supportive accommodation options with wraparound services. I think there's probably a service gap in a lot of regional areas, particularly the wraparound services for that. So that's something to consider, arguably, that there perhaps needs to be a greater focus on wraparound services and how that feeds into different housing.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've all made a really valid and powerful argument for the impact that a lack of alternatives has as well, that your options are really constrained when you have no affordable housing to turn to. We have a question about, I like this question, what does your ideal nesting for mid to long-term housing look like from a location or structure perspective? Do you have a vision in your head of how we could do that, or what it might look like? Broad question.
Sorry, was that how we might nest in existing infrastructure, or
what would a mid to long term solution look like? And I know, Kathleen, you mentioned in your presentation that we don't encourage people into the social housing system, and there might be different reasons for that. What is a good solution?
Well, build more social housing would be one of those solutions. I mean, we did speak to the social housing situation is just massive shortage across the country. So not many women are able to enter social housing out of family violence, but one of the big attractions for women was the security of tenure that it offered and the guarantee of affordability. So the landlord's not going to be putting your rent up in 6 months, 12 months' time. That said, there are well-documented issues in some social housing areas that make those environments perhaps less appropriate for people with experienced trauma. However, I think those issues are in part dealt with investment in the system. So I think there's a desperate need for investment in social housing and in secure, affordable rental, rather than what we're seeing, which is a reliance on the market to deliver everything. And the market is not the solution that we're looking for here. It just doesn't work for this particular group of people who are in need of housing.
So a question for you, Erica. Oh, Jeanette, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'd have to agree with Kathleen. Absolutely, we need to invest in the social housing. We also need, for some women, the wraparound services. We can't, just necessarily assume that the house is all that's needed. But look, there are some great examples. In Victoria, the Macaulay Community Services Women provide a fantastic medium-term accommodation, amazing supports to the women who need those supports while they're in that housing. It can be, up to 2 years, and then they, if they move out of that incredibly supportive environment, they definitely need the social housing and possibly that, the continued support, but maybe not as intense in that 12-month to 2-year period. So there's models out there that work, but they need scaling up. So they really, they need investment in them to scale up. But Kathleen, absolutely agree with you. Bottom line is we need the social housing at the end of it.
Yeah. Actually,
you go on, Erica.
Oh no, I had a question for Jeanette, actually. Just something that I heard speaking to one of the providers is that they had quite a good transitional housing stock that was good quality, and that they considered good quality, and that they felt that when social housing came up as an option, particularly the social housing that they were presented with, that it was quite poor quality, and therefore people didn't want to move from transitional housing into certain types of social housing. And something that stuck with me in that interview was that she lamented the fact that potentially some of that transitional housing stock could be converted into long-term housing or social housing, and that there could be opportunities to broker that relationship and perhaps shift poorer quality social housing into transitional housing. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, Erica, before I worked with women's property issues, I actually worked for a women's homelessness service, and we were faced with that situation pretty regularly where, well, you know, I still remember one of the women who was living in a transitional house that was quite nice, and unfortunately the public housing house that she was offered, she walked in and just burst into tears because of the state of it. It hadn't been cleaned up since the previous tenant, and it would be cleaned up before she moved in, but she really just said, "Is this all I'm worth?" That was the whole impression of it to her. I mean, it was dreadful. It had syringes in the backyard. It was just absolutely, to be showing anyone through a house in that state was not okay. But I remember distinctly at that time talking to what was then the Office of Housing about saying, why can this woman not stay in her transitional house? She would put down her roots here. She's happy in this house. Why can this house not become her home, her public housing home? And yes, convert that one to transitional housing, or upgrade it or something like that. So Erica, I'd be supporting that could be an option, but it just doesn't ever seem to have been taken up. Of course, if the house is a head leased house, there's an issue there because it's a private landlord who owns that house, and you'd have to convince them to do that. But they weren't all, many of them were public houses that were transitional houses.
I mean, I think the quality of existing public housing stock is a known issue, and it's an issue of investment. So housing authorities have made their budgets, have got their budgets to meet in the middle by not investing in maintenance and upgrades where they should have been investing in maintenance upgrades. So the quality of that stock is very poor. But this quality issue came through really strongly in our research as particularly for women who were in relationships where their partner had not been physically violent to them, but had been violent in other ways. And they were coming into either crisis or transitional or long-term housing that was really poor quality, and they were looking at their kids and they might have come from quite nice housing, and they were thinking, well, what am I doing to my kids, bringing them into this kind of environment? He's never hit me. Maybe for the sake of my kids, I should go back. So I think it is. I think, was it Erica said it? Oh no, Jeanette said, what is this? What I'm worth? I think we need to be giving women the message that they are worth something more than just a crummy old property somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and that does take investment and money.
Yeah. But
I think it's important investment and money, because otherwise women do go back.
Yes, they certainly do. We've seen that so many times, that they go back to a relationship that is not safe, and yes, to get a roof over their heads. But as you say, and the many things that I think you highlighted, Kathleen, in your presentation as well, that if the risk of losing their children, the risk of losing custody of their children, if they go to a rooming house or go to a caravan or some other sort of accommodation that isn't considered to be adequate, huge decisions that we're making.
I mean, that was a whole other section of our research, which was looking at the intersection between the child protection system and the DFV system and the housing system, and how that all plays out. Our research was on mainstream services. Some colleagues were doing a parallel piece of work on Indigenous family violence, and for those women in particular, it was meaning removal of children almost automatically. Really, really horrific kind of, and there's a whole, that there's a whole kind of colonial legacy going on there. But it's putting women in an awful position, because exposing your children to violence is child abuse, being homeless is child abuse, being in inadequate housing is child abuse. There's no housing that's adequate. What do you do? Like, how can you, you know, and you're trying to do the right thing by your kids the whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think these are valid things to be discussing. To go a slightly different direction with a question, and maybe Erica, you would be a good one to respond to this. Is there any research into the involvement of designers or architects to create temporary or pop-up accommodation, or has it been mostly focused on hotels and repurposing commercial buildings? And I guess as a secondary question, is a pop-up or temporary accommodation outcome a good outcome? What do you guys think?
As part of the research for this project, and also as part of my PhD research, when I was in Canada, and particularly in Vancouver, I saw some fantastic examples of vacant, often city-owned land that had been very quickly by our standards, converted into, I guess, a housing first model. So in a sense, through a modular or prefab construction techniques. So I think that there has been sort of a marriage of convenience, if you will, between these sort of more rapid building methods and transitional housing. So and a lot of these projects are premised on you know, leases that might be for 2 years or 5 years. So they offer some, in some senses, some stability. And it also allows or gives the city flexibility in terms of how they intend to use the land. So yeah, I think that there's definitely more opportunities there.
Thank you.
I think it would be the pop-ups, and you know, we have some limited examples here in Victoria, and they're absolutely serving a purpose and providing reasonable accommodation, but you know, the issue again is where do they go when that land needs to be repurposed by the landowner for, you know, why they bought it for in the first place. So the long-term housing yet again becomes the issue.
And I think sometimes there becomes a conflict between just solving a problem because you need to immediately solve a problem rather than focusing on long-term best case scenarios when you're just confronted by that level of need. And in fact, there was a question earlier in the feed that I didn't ask and I'd like to ask. Jeanette, you said that you've put in the application for 100 women. Do any of you want to comment on any figures we have on the level of need we have on a broader scale? What kind of a scale are we talking about when we're talking about housing for survivors of family violence?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't have the figures, but I mean, there are turnaway rates that are unacceptable. Any turnaway rate is unacceptable. I think, or if you look at the Specialist Homelessness Service stats, there's not a lot of kind of movement. So the biggest determinant of the housing that you end up in after you've received specialist homelessness support is very much where you went in. So if you were stably housed before you went into specialist homelessness support, you have a good chance of being stably housed at the end. But if you were homeless, your chances of transitioning into something really secure and stable are pretty low. And I don't think that's a reflection on services per se. I think that's a reflection on the lack of exit points. So I think I don't have the figures off the top of my head around demand, but there is definitely a substantial and unacceptable proportion of unmet need in the system.
I think the statewide Family Violence Service Safe Steps pre-COVID was reporting about 60 women needing crisis accommodation per night. So yeah, and you know, a lot of that was in your not so good quality hotel accommodation. They were needing to put women because there was not enough refuge accommodation. So, yeah, and I expect it's probably increased. If you're talking about the police getting 200 reports a day, I think that's probably during COVID. I think it's the need is probably increased than the 60.
Yeah, I was just going to, Jeanette, I was just going to say that I spoke to a homelessness provider, and they said that they've reported a 6-fold increase on requests for accommodation.
Yeah, I think
I don't find that surprising.
yeah, I think demand for support is starting to increase. I mean, certainly that's the reports from the sector in Tasmania that during lockdown there was so many measures in place to kind of protect people, but as those are starting to lift, they're starting to see demand come up again, and genuine concern about what happens when some of those COVID related measures are lifted. So when people lose access to extra income, when the eviction moratoriums end, that kind of thing, what are the implications of all of that? And that just adds to demand in the system. Because, I mean, not all homelessness demand is from women leaving violence. It's one of the biggest causes. But there's all this other demand as well that services are trying to juggle. And that goes back to the regional area as well, because your shelter in a regional area is likely to be dealing with everybody. There's not a lot of specialisation going on. So,
yes. And I think that's potentially a good note to end on, is the idea that this is one issue nested within a lot of interconnecting issues, and it's about security of tenure, and it's about women, but it's about everyone else in the system as well. And I guess we can't think about it as a siloed problem, because everything is interconnected and exacerbated by COVID-19. I'm just watching the time, and I realise we've gone over. So I'd just like to say a really heartfelt thank you to our panel. You've all been incredibly interesting and brought really important perspectives to the table. I know that there are questions that we haven't answered, and there's also been people who have generously added resources into our chat. There's over 15 questions we didn't get answered, which I really I'm sorry about, but I think perhaps this also is an opportunity to think of ways that we can curate an ongoing conversation, and maybe think about other ways that we can answer those questions in other formats. So I would conclude by saying thank you to everyone who's still with us. Also by plugging our next lecture, which will be in 2 weeks' time, same place, same time, and it's on the impact of housing and internal temperatures and air quality on health. So totally different topic, but we're still talking housing, and we're talking housing and health. And when we send out an email to you after this event, we'll have a link to that one, and maybe also some links to some of the information that we've been discussing today. The other thing is, for those of you that have asked, yes, we are recording. Yes, this recording will be made available, and we'll put it up on the Hallmark website.